welcome back to the Theology Pugcast. That's assuming that this is a return visit for you. Hopefully it is, but if that's not the case, and this is the first show you've ever heard, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I've been a professor of philosophy, a real estate investor, and a home improvement contractor, and I've even written some books. Anyway, that's enough about me. How about you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired history professor, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and Ministry Associated Reflections Ministries.
All right. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and the subject for the day, since it's your day?
My day. All right. I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, ethics, and philosophy. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And the topic of the day is... straight for the new year. Well, second week of shows in the new year is atheism. Our non-great friend atheism. What I want to do is talk about maybe what we could call varieties of atheism. That's not new to me. John Gray wrote an interesting book called the Seven Types of Atheism. John Gray is an atheist, but of a peculiar sort. And one of the things that is great about that book is he's very honest with the various types and their limitations. For example, when he talks about the first type, which we're probably most familiar with, what he calls the new atheism, he says, in the first chapter, I will discuss the so-called new atheism. This contains little that is novel or interesting, and after the first chapter, I will not refer to it again.
That's great.
And that's great. And so I'm going to kind of pivot off of some of what he says and then kind of just open the floor for us to kind of enter into it. But a lot of times I think people confront, modern atheism. They usually have in mind these popular notions. We've discussed in previous shows something like the New Atheist, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens was another one of these figures, and Sam Harris. And these tend to be figures that have embraced a certain a scientism, as we talked a little bit about in the last show, and see it as kind of a competitive worldview to any kind of what they would call religious interpretation of the world. And so they see kind of religion as just a primitive explanation of things. Science has kind of rid us from that primitive explanation and gives us a kind of mature explanation of things for which we don't need, God or the gods any longer to talk about reality.
Which is ironic, because I think of that particular strand of atheism as the most juvenile.
Yes. Yes, and it's filled, interestingly. I mean, maybe we can start here. It's usually filled with the same kind of floor stomping as the fundamentalisms it kind of seeks to address.
Yeah, I actually think the people that move from fundamentalism into atheism are actually guilty of the same thought crimes, just in a different way.
Yeah.
And as a historian, the thing that I find most bewildering, or even just as a person who occasionally engages in a little bit of thinking, they seem to think that the objections that they're raising are new and novel.
Right.
And they seem to assume that, somehow for thousands of years, Christians and Jews have studied these texts and have missed some obvious problems and contradictions.
That's right.
And they also seem to have forgotten that all of these problems and contradictions have been addressed rather thoroughly by lots of other thinkers whose names they actually even know.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And they read the biblical text the same way that a hyper fundamentalist would read the biblical text.
All right. So now I'm interested in knowing the other six. Are you going to go through the list, Tom?
Yeah, I'll go through the list, and then we can kind of maybe go through variations of each. So the second one that he kind of discusses is what he would call secular humanism. he calls it a hollowed out version of Christian belief in salvation in history. And I think a lot of this kind of, we still feel the ramifications of a lot of this kind of, what I would call Enlightenment inversion of Christian beliefs, the way in which it adopts a sort of redemptive picture, a salvation picture, a liberation picture that it draws from Christianity, and then secularizes it and acts like it was really, the only thing that Christianity had about it is it could carry that which is better put in a mature, secular version.
Yeah, I'm currently reading a book by James Burnham entitled "The Suicide of the West," which is an older book. It was actually published in the early '60s, and what's kind of comforting and unnerving about it at the same time is that you can read it as like contemporary, except just the names are different. So instead of Bernie Sanders, you're dealing with Hubert Humphrey, that kind of stuff. And but one of the things he has a chapter on that really I think gets at this very thing is a chapter on liberal guilt. So what he proposes is that human beings are dealing with a kind of existential problem, ontological problem when it comes to guilt. It's not just simply personal guilt. And Christianity addresses it. But with the rejection of Christianity, the guilt remains. And now there's a need to sort of self-redeem. And what drives liberal guilt is this need for redemption, but it presents itself as offering genuine solutions to real problems, but that's actually not what it's up to. It's up to assuaging the guilty feelings. That's the real issue. So the idea is just do something. In other words, it doesn't matter if it makes it worse. At least you're doing something. You're demonstrating your worth. The term we use today is virtue signaling. But I think he's right. I think that there's a kind of preconscious, existential kind of a thing that people are trying to address with liberalism. Now, obviously I'm a Christian, so this helps. But we know people who are Christians who say they're Christians who seem to suffer from the same complex.
Yes.
But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I remember, I think it was R.C. Sproul's great term that, we're guilty of cosmic treason. I mean, I think that's a comprehensive way of putting what is at the root of our guilt. So it requires this complete fix, right, that only God is capable of dealing with. And so, yes, when people reject that and then place the burden back on themselves or their own resources, and think that, kind of like Protestant liberalism tried to do, to seek a kind of a social way of outworking that guilt in a way that it kind of, the good outweighs the bad, and it never ends up doing it. And then you also get the other side where people begin to scapegoat because they need to get the guilt off themselves. So it's better, okay, I can't fix this through my own goodness and virtue signaling, so I need to blame this other person for whatever went wrong here.
Yeah, Rene Girard does a great job of analyzing that. Yeah.
Well, actually, you have to take it back a step further, I think, in that the assumption is that people are basically good.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the world's screwed up and a lot of bad things happen. Yeah. So the question becomes, how do you explain that if people are basically good? Well, the answer is that the problem is found in institutions and systems.
Yeah.
Ignoring the fact that these institutions and systems are made up of people who are basically good. So how does that happen? But then along with that, what you get, I think, in secular humanism is a recognition of at least some things that are genuine evils.
Yeah.
Some of the things that they call evil aren't necessarily evil. Some of the things they call good aren't necessarily good. But they do identify some genuine evils that they want to address, they want to try to fix, but they want to do it in such a way that denies their personal guilt.
Yeah.
And that ends up being where the problem is. in a lot of ways, because by failing to recognize the issue of sin on an individual level, and therefore in their own lives, they come up with solutions that can't really solve anything.
That's right. And I think, along with this, and I think it's what Gray is onto, is there definitely is, if you had no Christianity, you would have no secular humanism, because the humanism that it tries to sell is a byproduct of Christian valuation of the human and significance of it, valuation of it. And you see this erode actually as Christianity starts to erode in society. And then you also have with it is this notion, a Pelagian notion, if you will, that we have no God's going to save us in the humanist creed, right? So we have to fall on our own resources. And so, I mean, I get the point that we're not supposed to be inactive. I mean, some people if it's, all up to God, why do anything? I mean, there is that psychology out there sometimes, and so there isn't attempts to change situations where sin can actually embed itself and hurt people. And so they see that kind of certain kinds of conservatism as basically status quo, not generating the right kinds of changes needed to help, human beings have better lives and the like. And so it becomes kind of a non-religious alternative, if you will, but it's living off of the capital of Christian ethics. So then he moves in John Gray moves in the book to a third kind of atheism, which he says makes a religion from science. And we've talked a lot about this before. He calls this evolutionary humanism, mesmerism, which is interesting, dialectical materialism, and contemporary transhumanism. So maybe that's a good place to kind of unpack a little bit.
Yeah, he's kind of put a lot of stuff together there that it's interesting to. I guess my take is that what you're working to do with this particular category is draw out a prescriptive outlook from a descriptive discipline or enterprise. And there's a kind of deception that's occurring. So, let's think about dialectical materialism as an example. So in case folks aren't familiar with it, that's Marxist approach, is the inversion of Hegel's approach. But basically, Hegelianism is idealist, whereas Marxism is materialist. So the idea being that, in the course of human history or in the course of history, there's a kind of working out of inequities, sort of in a kind of, I guess you could say, entropic process, because everything kind of settles scientifically into a sort of state of, stasis or heat death, as the scientists put it. So eventually, if things play out the way the scientists say they will, there will be a point at which we achieve heat death, and there's just nothing, happening anymore. That kind of, but that is perfect equality as well. I mean, everything is the same uniformly. And what Marx does is he takes this pseudoscientific application to human society and moralizes it. Says this is something we have to pursue. It goes from being an is to an ought.
Yeah, there's your in a strange way, it's the kind of a lot of people, when they criticize people committed to natural law theory, think this is what's going on. That you're saying is just because it is the case, therefore just because nature disposes itself this way, therefore it ought to. And we always kind of show the qualifications and how that's a distortion of what true natural law thinking is. But here you do sort of have, if evolutionary humanism again, that on the one hand, that whatever happens, therefore, for the survival of the species, therefore it starts to take on this valuation of good. Why does it have to take on a good valuation at all? I mean, this is one of the the points. I mean, we can say that we're disposed to want it to be that way, but we can also be such like we're doing today, where we feel like we need to sacrifice a lot of humanity for the planet, right? So we can kind of, move away from a humanistic kind of evolutionary thinking to some, something else. Mesmerism, maybe Glenn will unpack.
Mesmerism. Mesmer was one of the people who really kind of documented and developed ideas that we would describe as hypnosis. And he believed that there were animal spirits that were operative in the world, and through the process of mesmerizing or hypnotism, you could access and work with these and so on. I don't remember all of the details.
Yeah.
But the point is, the reason why he falls into this category is that he believed that what he had was a scientific explanation of human behavior.
Yeah. Now, was this at all related to Christian Science? Mary Baker Eddy and her malicious animal magnetism stuff.
Yeah. Ultimately, they're all manifestations of something connected to a movement called New Thought in America.
Yeah.
Now, Mary Baker Eddy would deny the influence of this on her thinking, although when you look at her biography, it's kind of hard to take her too seriously on that point.
Yeah.
But Mesmer ties into this and so on. And by the way, New Thought is also a major contributor to what we would describe as the New Age movement, or I prefer to call it New Spirituality. It's also connected in occult stuff and indirectly to neo-paganism. All of these things all tie together. But in mesmerism, you have a particular pseudoscientific way of understanding all of this.
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating that he lumps it as a form of kind of atheism and scientism. And yet it is a window. It helps explain why this could thrive in the kind of post-Enlightenment world where, when they were on the one hand trying to get rid of the supernatural, trying to get rid of anything that talked of kind of a divine action within history, to replace it with a whole, pseudo-spiritual world that one can enter into. And again, we've seen, examples, especially in the so-called high enlightened culture societies that they were practicing seances and all kinds of things, kind of thrived in that, the Masons and the like. And he throws in here, of course, contemporary transhumanism, which is, again, this movement from, here is a place at which, humanity, again, is going to have the capacity to save itself, right, in some way.
Well,
and direct its own evolution.
That's the thing. It's the entry of the ought into the is. So evolution, as evolutionists tell us, is an unplanned process. In other words, there's no intelligence at work in it. And now we're going to introduce intelligence in order to take evolution to the next level, which is just pretty weird when you think about it. If they were consistent, they would just say, well, it'll take care of itself if it's going to happen, or maybe not. Again, this getting back to sort of theories of evolution, there was a kind of naive 19th century take on it, which got rid of the creator but still had purpose at work, and so higher forms of life and this all of the language that was kind of inherited from a hierarchical understanding of the cosmos is imported into this, or sort of syncretized into this kind of materialism. But now you've got a situation with kind of the new or neo-Darwinism where that's not present anymore. It just stuff happens, and whatever, and there's no real rhyme or reason to it. But this brings up something I think that's worth reflecting on a little bit. In my reading, and maybe I've mentioned this before, if I have, just kind of hang with me. But in my reading of Hannah Arendt's on the origins of totalitarianism, one of the things that she says in that work that really took me by surprise is her analysis of the Nazis, she said that they weren't nationalists. Now, she didn't have the word transhumanist to work with, but what she described is transhumanism. And that's what we're getting at here. They wanted to take, of course, they didn't have gene splicing. They didn't have the various technologies and the subtle, sort of subtleties, that we have today with regard to our knowledge of genetics. But they had an intuition that if you could control the process of reproduction, you could create higher forms of humanity. That was their ideal.
And actually any cattle herder knows that that's true.
Mm-hmm. Sure. But it was always seen as being off limits to apply this to human beings.
Right.
Yeah.
And until the eugenics movement, which was really centered in the United States.
And I think that's another thing. There are a lot of things that she brought out in that book where she made that connection. She was essentially saying that the Nazis had learned some things from us in America.
Yeah, well, that comes out at the Nuremberg trials. Basically, they said, look, these were the things your own people were advocating. Well, what we did is put them into practice.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, and it has been going on. And I mean, and now they're making it, available to, public consumers. I mean, even with the kind of stuff they're trying to do with children and alterations and the like, to think that we can somehow improve upon what we've been endowed with through technique and psychological, manipulation, and
even technology, physical technology.
Yeah, I like the word technique there because that's a word that Tolkien uses regularly as the evil of magic.
Right.
That it relies on technique and things like that to exert control over people or nature. And what we're doing with transhumanism is exactly that. Tolkien saw magic, of course, as evil, as distinct from enchantment, which was positive.
Yeah, the guy who really sort of tipped me off to this was Jacques Ellul. Jacques Ellul, in his analysis, says that technology and technique are really the same thing.
Yeah,
and Tolkien adds magic too.
Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting here when he's talking about this as kind of one of the types of atheism. It's how it has been ripped from, of course, the core transcendent vision of the classical world and Christianity in particular. Once it has been unmoored from that, it runs loose. Now, one of the things he says at the beginning of this book, which is very interesting, is he says, even in the whole Hellenic and the Greek philosophical world, you didn't have the equation of knowledge with the good the way Christianity did, and so he says that this actually gets picked up and absorbed by all these kinds of atheism, but the problem is it doesn't have any kind of proper good other than the knowledge itself. Guiding it. So knowledge not grounded in the good becomes the good itself, if you will, and it becomes undirected or directed towards, it would go places we don't want to go. Let's put it this way.
Well, and actually, Christianity has been well aware of this for centuries. This is the whole essence of the Faustus myth or legend. Who sells his soul for knowledge, and he gains knowledge, but he literally loses his soul. In a lot of ways, our culture is living Dr. Faustus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so we you can really see how, I think, a few years back, the kind of evolutionary humanism was kind of, was in a lot of the literature. It was almost the way a lot of, Christians were sort of coming up with ways of connecting a Christian reading of that. I think, was it Teilhard de? What was his name?
Yeah. I know that it's the Roman Catholic.
Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah.
We need you to help us with those French names there.
French word.
Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah. I mean, he really popularized this in kind of Catholic thinking, gave it a sort of, baptized it in a kind of Catholic view. But you have had a lot of this stuff spilling over, but. And there was a lot of attraction in the kind of intellectual Christian circles of finding ways to take what they found as valuable insights from these secular reinterpretations of Christianity, and then kind of make Christianity more palatable by trying to reinterpret it within those parameters. And I think this is where you had your debates, I mean, especially within, the Roman Catholic world, between, with modernity and leading to Vatican II. And then we're kind of seeing it unfold everywhere in the Protestant world.
The interesting thing about this is if you read Tom Holland, Dominion, right, what he points out is that Christianity created the modern world, created our system of ethics, and just sort of the way we see the world. And the irony is you get secular humanism coming out of that, and then this next series of movements coming out of secular humanism, and you've now got Christianity trying to catch up somehow with those, when in fact we're at the root of all of it. Yeah. And what these things are declensions away from what we start with.
I think that one of the things that we also see kind of as, I think, a more healthy response is the ressourcement movements, both in Catholicism and Protestantism, returning to the fathers. My first encounter with this was Tom Oden back in the 80s, when Tom Oden, went from being a kind of a liberation theology guy to let's get back to the creeds guy. That was a watershed, I think, for a lot of folks. And I think a lot of healthy things are happening, but it's going to take a long time for this to filter through all of the churches and the nooks and crannies of the Christian world. It took a long time for us to get here. This didn't happen overnight. I think it's going to take a while, centuries, to get worked out in the other direction.
Yeah. Well, and I, one of the things you see, I think one of the fascinating things that you do see, I mean, studying something of the history of it, is just the way Christians do lose sight of what is theirs and start to run with those distortions as if that was the genuine article, so to where eventually you have evangelicals working off of methodologies of, within the polarities, or within the parameters set up by the Enlightenment. And I mean, so afraid that it's going to be, written out of the public realm of intelligibility if it doesn't basically express itself within these parameters. And then in doing that, when it finally sort of comes of age and adopts these methodologies, it becomes unimportant and insignificant. And it's actually...
Yeah, we that a movement has run its course when the evangelical church jumps on the bandwagon. It's over at that point. We mentioned earlier the existentialist. One of the things that encourages me when it comes to postmodernism is the fact that back when I was in school in the 70s and 80s, I mean the existentialism was like hot. It was cool. It was the thing everybody was into. And now it's sort of like, who are those guys? Jean-Paul, what's his name? Sartre?
Wasn't Jean-Paul one of the popes?
That's right.
Now, the thing is, as an intellectual movement, postmodernism is dead.
Yeah.
If you look at if you take a course in an English department on the postmodern novel, everything they're reading is at least 30 years old.
Yeah.
But what's happened, and people have called this different things. You've got, some people call it amateur postmodernism. I've run into that term. John Stonestreet over at Breakpoint calls it a postmodern mood. What's happened is that elements of postmodernism have so seeped into the consciousness of people that even though postmodernism itself as an intellectual movement is dead, people still think in terms of those categories.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah, and we're going to live with that for a while. I'm afraid that, when we think about how does God argue? Well, when God speaks, things happen. God argues with history. God argues with like pestilence and war It's like
and weather.
That's right. That's right. You want that? Well, we're going to give it to you good and hard. We'll see how you like it.
Yeah, that's actually sort of an interesting point that someone I was talking to mentioned. He said, if you look at Scripture, you find that weather, natural disasters, and things like that are acts of God.
Yeah,
much like the way they talk about them in insurance policies.
Yeah.
But those are acts of God, often in response, not always, but often in response to human behavior.
Right.
And yet we do not even consider the possibility that happens anymore.
Yeah.
In biblical terms, that is the first thing we should be thinking of.
Yeah.
That is the normal interpretation.
Right. Yeah. I remember I was in the Northridge quake in Los Angeles. Was it 94, 92? I can't remember. But anyway, I was flying out of Los Angeles after the quake. I mean, and driving to the airport was kind of a crazy experience because, shattered glass everywhere, huge plumes of flame coming up from the gas lines. It was like you were in Beirut or something. And I remember flying out that morning and having listened to the television reporters describe the event. They were shaken themselves. You could hear the tremor in their voices. And I thought to myself, if this can't get our attention, what will? In other words, none of the people in the media were talking about what you just described, Glenn. Maybe there's something God is trying to say to us here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
that just was never entertained.
Yeah, well, my favorite example of that is when the Lutheran Church was voting on whether or not to ordain homosexuals. The church that they were meeting in got hit by a tornado.
They didn't get the message.
Just before the vote. And they talked about this. Maybe this is a sign for God. Ha, 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 ha.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, and, and that one of the, you see, there's, besides the kind of issues of weather, it's also the falling of a civilization, the way in which politics is taken over by that, which is the judgment on a people when the political system is actually given over. You read the Old Testament constantly. There is this, your land is being taken from you. You're being ruled and oppressed by someone else when you're, so there definitely is this deeper connection between the human being and their moral relation and religious relation to God, and the reality that can become the byproduct of getting out of sync with that, right? Not honoring God above all things. You want to heal the world in all of its problems is a people who love the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, soul, body, and strength first, and love their neighbor as themselves, right? Those balanced the right way are going to have the kind of consequences in which flourishing takes place. You don't do that, guess what? There are all kinds of consequences, and some of those are those direct acts. And you think about, what happens to a human being when they're confronted by something like a tornado coming? Are you ever aware of how fragile you are and how you're nothing? You think of the story in the scripture when the disciples are out on the boat and Jesus is sleeping and the storm comes up. And it is what a great, is God not sleeping, right? When the storm comes up and actually, Jesus eventually, peace be still, and they grow increasingly more afraid, right? When they actually see the one who controls everything, not just the storm itself. And really, I think, like you said, we can be afraid of the storm itself because oftentimes we don't confront directly the reality, the one who actually controls the storm itself.
Whenever I think about that story, I think about Rembrandt's Jesus on the Sea of Galilee and the fact that was stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and I wonder, will we ever get it back? I actually saw it in person before it was stolen. It was impressive in just about every way. It was very large, a very large canvas.
Wow.
I'm reminded of. Despair.com is a website that does demotivation posters.
Yeah.
And I was given a demotivator calendar one year, which came with a poster that had a picture of a tornado on it. And it said, when the winds of change blow hard enough, even the most trivial things can become deadly projectiles.
Yeah, there's a great one that I remember where it was like this guy was playing chess and he's moving a pawn and it said sacrifice. You are the pawn.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on and on about demotivators, but I think we should probably get back to atheists. There's a connection there somewhere.
There is.
Well, that's where, and I think in the book, a lot of times that's where he is heading. Well, the next group, he says, and these overlap somewhat, but is the modern atheism that is the modern political religions, from Jacobinism through communism, Nazism, to contemporary evangelical liberalism is what he calls it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I would say, wokeism is a kind of a variant of that.
I would like to understand what he was implying with evangelical liberalism.
Yeah, and because I haven't gotten through that chapter, I've been working through this book, I haven't gotten through that chapter, so that may be one we need to revisit, but I can definitely see where he would go with that.
Yeah, I don't think he means what probably comes to mind for many of our listeners, kind of our woke brothers and sisters in the evangelical world. I think he's probably just thinking about a kind of aggressive, sort of proselytizing liberalism. Yeah.
And I think he is kind of, again, I could be corrected when I work through that part, but I do think it's a recognition that kind of liberalism, even though it owes itself to kind of Christianity and monotheism, is the way he puts it, it has evacuated. Well, it has basically left all of the proper theological setting and meaning for that comes with Christianity. So it defines it very differently. And evangelical liberalism is very much just liberalism at that point.
Yeah. I feel obligated to point out that Jacobinism has as its roots a guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah, there you go.
Just need to put this in.
Right.
No, that's important. And well, I mean, Rousseau, as we know, we've visited enough, but he sort of creates his own kind of redefinition of the creation account, right? And right here you have this move towards a alternative to Christianity, or a better insight into its impulses.
Well, this gets me thinking about denominations. So he's describing 7 kinds of atheism, or 7 varieties, and I can't help but think that maybe this is a parallel to what we see in theism, where we have different varieties of theism.
Yeah.
They're not mutually exclusive. They're in some sense dependent upon a certain set of assumptions that they share in common, but they are different emphases. One of the things, that I'm working on, as you know, is a book on totalitarianism, and all of these things are in play with regard to totalitarianism, but it's hard to provide a neat and yet comprehensive sort of analysis, because there are so many things going on that seem to, at one level, contradict other parts of what we see. And nevertheless, there is at the same time, a kind of harmony. So let's think about Rousseau and his emotivism and compare that to, say, the cerebral kind of juvenile, angry atheism of the new atheists. How are they compatible? Well, they are at a pretty fundamental level. They're kind of working off the same script in a lot of ways, but with enough difference that you could say that they are different things, but part of a common outlook, I suppose.
Yeah, they share core commitments, and I think that's what he's on to with contemporary evangelical liberalism. He could probably even define that as like the religious right, in the sense that it is a it is within that same set of commitments that you would have secular atheistic religions. It shares enough of the commitments the same way.
Yeah, that when you talked about evangelical liberalism, that is exactly what came to my mind. Is the religious right.
Yeah.
Because although we don't typically use the language that way, liberalism, in its traditional meaning, classical liberalism, is American conservatism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and this is, again, this book I'm working through, The Suicide of the West by James Burnham, he gets into that. He talks about this fascinating transition that occurs in liberalism, that occurs in the late 19th century, in which there's a shift from seeing the government as the primary threat to the means by which the primary threat is, sort of defeated, and so you see this transition. But you're right. There is this kind of larger, kind of atomistic, individualist, and as you like to say, voluntarist, Tom, kind of dimension to things. I thought a number of times about those kind of brands of Protestantism that have done best in America. They tend to be the ones that are most kind of in harmony with the larger sort of structure or trajectory of American culture. Take, for example, and we've got a lot of friends who are Baptists, but there's something in their anti-clericalism. They're also anti-establishment. They're also elitist. They're although those things are, kind of part of the American story as well. Think about Pentecostalism and its emphasis on experience and emotions. Yeah. That's very much in harmony with the American outlook. Now, what are the sort of the expressions of Christianity that have a really hard time here? Well, Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, it has a real hard time. You got to be a really kind of esoteric, kind of unique, sui generis kind of person, to find Orthodoxy.
Although it's making a lot of ground. So.
It is. Yeah. But still, it's a tiny minority of the larger Christian world in America. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the that's interesting in its own way. I think, and for good or for bad, or for better or for worse. Sorry, because you think Baptist worlds. I grew up in a lot of that, and on the one hand, I remember kind of the old school Baptist world that did have some kind of connection to its own tradition and traditions. And it's, a strong emphasis on passing those down, but it had to do it in a very strong authoritarian way because it needed to do from generation to generation and keep other voices out. But then you had this kind of shift to the purpose-driven world in which, how are we going to stay alive in a world that, will not embrace that kind of strict sectarianism? And so what we end up doing is kind of refashioning the patterns of worship and life to kind of mimic or make themselves palatable to the culture. And then we end up becoming like the culture, and then we become having no, real critical edge on the culture. Then we become basically defenders of the culture that we were supposed to, convert. And so you do have they thrive in the way that certain kind of businesses have been able to stay in business by adjusting to the times.
Yeah, I've argued for a long time that there's nothing less relevant than a church that tries to be relevant.
Yeah,
and Os Guinness wrote a wonderful book called Prophetic Untimeliness.
Yeah,
and the core idea there is that the only message that is eternally relevant is an eternal message. It is a message that isn't blown about by the winds of culture and the demands of the current age. And our job is to be presenting eternal truths, not things that are perceived as being relevant to the culture. Because the only way to address the things that are relevant to the culture is through the lens of that which is eternal.
it's interesting on that point, because, and I think I've mentioned this before, but there is a moment, a historical moment in Christianity in America, where Karl Barth actually visited the U.S. one time in his life. And, he had a lot of fans here, but he had a lot of critics. And he was speaking at an event, I think at University of Chicago, to which Carl F.H. Henry was attending. And Carl was not a huge, he respected Barth as a scholar, but didn't like his approach to things. And when he had his chance to ask Karl Barth a question, he said, "This is Carl F.H. Henry from Christianity Today." And Karl Barth's response to him was, "You mean Christianity of yesterday?" And Carl Henry, of course, won the moment. He goes, "No, I mean Christianity the same yesterday, today, and forever." But I think Karl Barth actually had his finger on the pulse, because we see where Christianity today ended up going. Yeah. Because of the emphasis on the today, it wasn't on the same today, yesterday, today, and forever. Yeah. And therefore, it became a trend follower. And it loses sight of the larger transcendent vision that keeps Christianity within parameters of being able to define it from age to age.
Right. So how many have we gotten through? Is it 5?
We that was 4. These next ones we can do kind of briefly. 5th is the atheism of God haters, such as Marquis de Sade.
Okay.
And Dostoevsky's fictional character, Ivan Karasimov, and then William Empson, a writer he draws off of a lot in this book.
Interesting. So these are people who, at one and the same moment, affirm the existence of God because they hate him. Or is it just that they hate the idea?
I think they're repulsed by God in any sense of the word. So they're atheists by defiance, maybe is the way.
Yeah.
They will refuse to worship any kind of God to the point they will not grant God any existence.
Yeah.
I've heard this described as God doesn't exist and I'm mad at him.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. Well, we see a lot of that with the whole notion of, the way theodicy is put out there. In many cases, it's if there is a God, why are there so many, suffering children in the world? And if there isn't one, why would that really, other than just for sentimental reasons, be a problem?
Well, I've often wondered whether or not that's just a red herring when that particular objection is raised. In other words, this is a person that's made a commitment, is searching for a justification. I think, though, a lot of the things you talk about, Tom, concerning a faulty understanding of God. In other words, they've rejected a God. They hate a God that doesn't exist.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
But I wonder too whether or not there's something to be said for anger here. And here's what I mean. Births tend to be bloody, messy processes with lots of screaming and tears and blaming. So I remember Bill Cosby, who of course has fallen into disrepute, but he was still a funny guy for all of that. And he was talking about his wife giving birth and looking at him and blaming him.
One of the great lines was, and she told everybody in the room that my parents weren't married.
But if you know what I'm getting at, is that sometimes we'll say, well, we don't want to offend anybody. We don't want anybody to get angry, when perhaps anger is precisely the thing the person needs to go through in order to get to the other side of it.
Yeah, well, and there is. I think David Bentley Hart's written on this when he was talking about a lot about Ivan Karasimov. The character in Dostoevsky's work, and remember, there's an issue of a child getting sick, and this notion of, I think it's Ivan's response that, because a child can get sick or lose its mother or something along these lines, whatever notion of a God there is, I cannot see this God as good, right? So I cannot see, if one has the capacity to create something in which this wasn't a possibility, and then doesn't do it and causes this kind, So, I mean, there is, again, there are theological issues going on there, but you're right. From someone who isn't able to antenna those theological issues, they do lash out against that which should be seen as the giver of a gift towards that which is the giver of all this pain and suffering and hurt.
Well, I kind of think about it somewhat differently. It's still in harmony with what you're saying, Tom. You're familiar with Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of death and dying. One of the stages is anger. Right?
Yeah.
So what a person is leaving behind is a life to begin a new life. And there's a death that occurs. We die, with Christ. So there's something that dies that we've loved and held on to, and we are angry that this is dying, even as we're being introduced to a new life. I think that's kind of what so when it comes to the work of an evangelist, sometimes the work of it, we have this idea that the evangelist is just greeted with smiles and just warm hugs and thanks But often the best evangelist is the person who can confront the anger and endure it and continue to speak the truth in love while they're being shouted at. Because why is the other person shouting? It's because their conscience is also shouting at them, this is right, and they're trying to drown it out.
Yeah.
I would say, by the way, these atheists who are angry with God overlap considerably with a number of the other categories.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. And I think the other categories are really the fruits of that. And I think there is a lot going on here. And that was a good nuance to it, Chris, because I do think that there is that too. Having to confront ourselves in the light is probably the most heinous things for us prior to rebirth, right? This sense in which, having to look at that ugliness in the face of pure holiness. And I do think sometimes that gets, I often do talk about the kind of the alternative competitive God, but I do think we can't skip over the fact that also confronting people when it comes to truth and beauty and goodness and anything like that is that it pours light on into the darkness, and the darkness can't outrun that light. And that where that can't be countenanced, you get a Desaad, and look at the ramifications of a life, and look at what he does to other people. That there is a certain kind of pleasure in pain, and this seeking, this kind of deeper torture to find some kind of deeper pleasure. It's a perversion, and probably its utmost sense. And culturally, I think we're getting there too. I think the way the sexual exploitation of children and the moving of things in this, this way of, chopping and cutting is starting to get into this kind of God hatred territory.
Yeah. Desaad actually argued that the greatest pleasure comes from violating the greatest number of taboos, and the most serious taboos. But there's an interesting corollary to this. There's an article on pornography that was, I think it was in the American Historical Review years ago, in which they argued that the things that show up in pornography are the things that are considered most, taboo, or evil within society. And thus, initially pornography, when you're looking at the old, the earliest versions of published pornography, it's just simply about sex.
Yeah.
With the 18th century, there is this movement that says that pain itself is the greatest evil and is therefore, in a sense, obscene. And so what you see happening is a shift in pornography toward obscenity, toward what was obscene in the minds of the people, which means you see Desaad coming up, and you see a rise in sadistic stuff emerging. And if you follow by that standard, that idea that the things that are considered the greatest obscenities
Yeah.
It's really interesting to look at the statistics that are published by somebody like Pornhub, where you'll see. I haven't seen one in a few years, but they show what are the things that people search for, and the general sense I've gotten. Again, I haven't seen this in a few years, but the general sense I've gotten is it's harder stuff. It's more sadistic. It is more incest oriented. It's a whole host of things of that sort.
Yeah. So we're getting kind of close to time here, Tom. Have we got two more to go?
Two more. I can blend them into each other because they are close. And these would be the two that John Gray kind of would, see he has more of affinity for. The 6 he calls the atheisms of George Santayana and Joseph Conrad, which reject the idea of a creator God without having any piety towards humanity. In other words, they don't see any point. I mean, you get rid of God, you don't need to have a special privilege for humanity. And then 7th and last, the mystical atheism of Arthur Schopenhauer and the negative theologies of Spinoza and 20th century Russian Jewish fideist Leo Shestov, all of which point to to a God that transcends any human conception, like just a pure mystical negation, like some type, like Derrida in many ways, and his kind of twisted postmodern sense, this kind of pure negation.
Yeah, Schopenhauer, had that kind of Buddhist Eastern kind of spin with, pure will. He was kind of a forerunner of Nietzsche. And pretty kind of depressed guy.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know if you've ever read any of his aphorisms or his, they're actually pretty good. He was actually a fan of Balthasar Gracian and, the Jesuit, whose, short, pithy sayings were so, I guess, Machiavellian in terms of their, kind of getting to the real root of human motivation and so forth, that he felt like it was a shame that the guy was a Catholic. But I guess there's something to that I find of the different forms that he identifies. That probably the last one that he identifies with is probably the least offensive to me. Or I could actually have a beer with that guy if you get my drift. I would need to maybe take a bath afterward, or maybe go and visit somebody that was genuinely upbeat and positive. But there's a sense in which it seems to me that is a kind of dipping into a hopeless but realistic assessment of human fallenness, if you get my drift.
Well, the one that intrigues me is the one before that, number 6, I guess it was.
Yeah.
Because in a very real sense, it's an inversion of Christian ethical theory, which fundamentally is rooted in love of God. And because human beings are made in the image of God, love of neighbor immediately follows. That's why those two commandments are paired. Yeah. And in fact, elsewhere in Scripture, you will find Jesus and Paul both saying that, loving your neighbor as yourself is the essence of the law. All of the law and the commandments are subsumed under loving your neighbor. But the reason for that is because your neighbor is made in the image of God, so love of God is primary.
Yeah.
What they're saying is that if you get rid of love of God, there's no need to love your neighbor.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It is in fact exactly the negation of the foundation of Christian ethics.
Yeah.
I find that, like I said, rather intriguing, what they're doing there. Although I do agree with Chris, it'd be more fun to have a beer with number 7.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things Gray is onto here is getting rid of these kind of these flowery versions of atheism that don't look at the consequences of really where this ends up if you take seriously what atheism entails. So if you do reject certain kinds of things and you do embrace certain kind of things, you don't get to have the you don't get to claim that a part of the coherence of your picture is such that it can underwrite a humanistic vision or something that is really has a human being as deserving any sort of piety.
Well, it also makes me wonder whether or not such a person just simply despairs for something that maybe he actually longs for. And in all of the other versions, I have a sense that there's kind of an alternative agenda that's being pursued, something that's maybe not adequately self-aware. Whereas in this last one, I think we have someone who is self-aware, has a full understanding of the implications, perhaps wishes that the Christian God were real, but can't bring himself to believe it, if you get my drift.
Yeah, I think, and I think that's why he wants to say there is this kind of mystical, he owes it to Russian Jewish fideists like, Leo Shestov and Spinoza, which, my hunch is maybe he has a Jewish background himself. I don't know enough about his history. But what you get there is a way of, I guess for him not having to, not having to embrace something with all the baggage that comes with it, and can still try to and can also see through the kind of nonsense that has come with attempts to get rid of religion and get rid of this. He sees the pursuit of religion as absolutely valid because it's about meaning. And like Glenn's point in the last show, and similar to way myth functions and logos. And so he said, this is something, science, scientism, atheism can't get rid of. He goes, on the other hand, I'm not trying to convert anybody to my position, right? This isn't something about me saying that, that this is, I've got a meaning frame that I need to pursue conversion to you. He sees it silly for an atheist to try to convert anybody.
It's more or less a ditch you fall into, you could say.
Yeah, and he also talks about, it's interesting in the first chapter when he's discussing the new atheism, and he's talking about the way they follow almost they adopt that Christian notion that knowledge is good, which wouldn't have come from their own assumptions, and that having a certain kind of clear, true view of reality is important. And he sees it first as undermined by their own commitments, because truth wouldn't have been aimed for by chance and survival, without there being a kind of a tell us. And so what he gets at there is he says in that case, illusion may be better for us for our own survival. Yeah. And so he says, why are they making all of this aim to clear religion from its illusions if, from their own understanding, illusion may be more valuable for survival than not? And then that brings a good question up. We pursue truth for something higher than merely survival. It's because we have a transcendent vision.
Yeah, why would you want to live in them?
Yeah, that actually echoes Plantinga's argument against, he argues that Darwinism and materialism, when you combine them, they're defeaters. If materialism is true, it's a defeater for Darwinism.
Yeah.
It parallels a similar argument by C.S. Lewis and other people. He's absolutely right there. I suspect he's read these guys.
Yeah. The good ones tend to do that. Say we should wrap up. It's got that to be about that time. Hey, that was great. That was a great topic, and I think that listeners are going to really get a lot out of this show, kind of hearing the description of these 7 types and our responses. Anyway, thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We really appreciate your support. If you'd like to support us in a financial way, that would be great. We have expenses. And you can do that by either going to our Patreon page and becoming a patron on a monthly basis. There are a number of people who support us that way, and those gifts do address the cost for producing the show. You can also support us through the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. There are even people who kind of chase us down and give us money. They go to a lot of work to do it, too. And we appreciate those folks. Anyway, thanks again, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye now.